Good afternoon. All right, so we've just read from Matthew chapter 24, so you've probably got a good idea of what the topic might be about this afternoon. But if we go, keep your Bibles open in Matthew 24, and let's have a look at verse 3. So go to verse number 3. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Now, these are some good questions that the disciples have for Jesus here, right? Now, if I was in their position, I'd be wanting to ask the same sort of question. I'd be, curiosity often gets the better of us, and if you were with the Son of God and you could ask him any question you wanted just before he was about to, die and be crucified and go, this is probably something that might be at the forefront of your mind. What's going to happen? When are you going to return? What's it going to be like? What do I need to look for? What are the answers to these questions? Now, in Matthew 24, we see Jesus go through, he gives a detailed answer here in Matthew 24 about exactly what to look out for and exactly how these events are going to unfold before his return in great detail. Because he wants them to know. He wants them to understand. He doesn't want them to fail to realize how it's going to happen. Now, here's the thing. The generation that's going to witness all these things, it could be our generation, it may be a future generation, we don't know. But whoever that generation is, if they understand the chronology of these events that Jesus describes here, they're not going to be fooled. They're going to know exactly what to look for. Now here, Matthew 24 verse 3, if we just go to verse... Now the thing I want to point out about this sermon, what I'm going to focus on in this particular sermon is these are the final 7 years, right, that Jesus is describing here in Matthew 24. And what I'm going to focus on in this sermon is the first 3.5 years. That's what this sermon is going to focus on. And if we continue in verse 4, and Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So I want to park it there. So Jesus gives us a description of these things that we can expect to unfold. Now what I want to point out, he calls this the beginning of sorrows. So this first period of time here, now this is before the Antichrist, where that abomination that causes desolation occurs, where he declares himself as God, this false Christ, this false Messiah. These are the events that take place before that occurs. Right? So here, these are some things we can look out for as believers before the Antichrist himself is actually revealed, before he reveals himself to the world. Right? Now, what we need to do here with this particular passage is we need to look at other passages of Scripture in the Bible to try and get a little bit more detail about what's going on here, right? Because at the moment, this does seem a little bit vague, right? It's not overly descriptive of exactly what to look for. And based on this description, you could point at various points in history where this has already occurred, right? Using this kind of description here. I mean, you could think about World War I, World War II, even times previous to that. And in fact, we're actually going to also see this afternoon that there is a dual fulfillment here as well in this particular passage of Scripture. So the thing I want to point out here is in verse 4, where Jesus says, so go back to verse 4, and Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Now before we go to some other passages of Scripture, what I want to point out here, historically, there have been so many false predictions and false claims, people claiming to be the Messiah, right, throughout history, even as far back as the 1st century AD. If you read in the book of Thessalonians, even Paul had to, address this issue when there were some people teaching that the Lord had already returned, like overthrowing the faith of some. That was in the 1st century AD. Now, it's only gotten worse since then. Like, it's kind of escalated. Like, it's almost every year now. You get somebody coming out claiming, this is the year that the Lord's going to return. And it's just all these predictions, they all fail. They all fail. They're all false. I'm going to give you some examples here. Now, when I Googled this, right, the list was just like pages and pages long. of all these false predictions. So I can't go through the whole list, right? But when I looked at it, I picked out some ones that I was personally familiar with. Now, the one that stood out to me the most was Charles Russell. Now, he's the founder of the false Jehovah's Witnesses, right? The Jehovah's False Witnesses and the Watchtower Society. Now, they predicted back in 1914 the return of the Lord. It didn't happen, right? Now, what false prophets do, or false organisations, people that make these false predictions, they always try and usually cover their tracks because it's so embarrassing, right? When they make these predictions and they don't come to pass. In fact, if we look at the Old Testament, these sorts of people are supposed to be stoned to death. False prophets are supposed to be stoned to death. And, you know, if that took place, then that would probably be the end of the Watchtower Society and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and we wouldn't have them today, right, if he was stoned to death. Unfortunately, that's not what took place. They carried on, but they try and cover their tracks. And, of course, Jesus didn't return in 1914, so Charles Russell explained it away by saying it was an invisible return of Jesus Christ. Of course it was, right? Of course it was. You know, it was a quiet return of the Lord. Now, and here's the thing about the Jehovah's Witnesses. You'd think that would be enough for their followers to just break up and go, okay, these guys are wrong, this is crazy, what am I doing as a part of this organisation? But no, they didn't. Not only in 1914 did they make false prediction, they also made one in 1918, 1920, 1925, 1941, 1975 and 1994. That's just crazy that they've still got people in their organisation. But people are just, I don't know, they're just willingly ignorant. They just don't care enough about this. Maybe they just think it's not that important that they made all these false predictions. But here's the thing. These false predictions have a huge impact on people's lives. Like, these sorts of predictions cause people to make certain decisions in their lives on what they're going to do with themselves, whether they're going to have children, all sorts of things, right? And I know personally, through my own experience with certain family members that are Jehovah's Witnesses, it impacted them and they didn't have any children because of the sort of things that they were teaching in this organisation. So these false prophets, they have a big impact on people's lives in a very negative fashion. Some other examples of the cult leader, David Koresh. He made a failed prediction in 1995, and we know where that ended, that cult leader, what happened in Waco, Texas. It was terrible. Stan Johnson of the Prophecy Club made a failed prediction. He predicted September the 12th, 1997. And here's the thing about Stan Johnson. He was 90% sure it would happen. Like, he's giving himself an out, right? There's a 10% chance it might not happen. Oh, what do you know? It didn't happen, right? Michael Drosnin, author of the Bible Code, he predicted 2000, 2006 and 2012. Hal Lindsey, 1988 and 2007. This is just a small sample of just false prophets making false predictions. And the thing about this is, these guys, I think they like to do this because it's sensational. And it draws attention from people, you know, it's sensational. And they make a lot of money out of this too, selling their books, their literature, like the Watchtower organisation, selling their giving out their Watchtower leaflets. All this sort of stuff, they make money out of this stuff. Now, what I want to point out about Matthew 24, when we go back in there, and we're going to look at some parallel passages here, other parallel passages that line up with Matthew 24, the Gospel of Mark chapter 13, and Luke 21. Now, we're not going to read through those particular passages, but they are parallel passages that you can look at in your own time, and you can see how these things marry up. They're all very similar. Now, if we go to Revelation chapter 6, so keep your spot in Matthew 24. But turn your Bibles to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, "Come and see." And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. Now, this white horse, in Scripture, this white horse represents the Antichrist, and otherwise known also in Revelation, the beast, is what he's referred to. And the thing about this is, and I believe the reason why a white horse is used here as a description of the Antichrist here, when this first seal is opened, is because we know in Revelation chapter 19, Jesus comes on a white horse. So the Antichrist he's a counterfeit, he likes to copy God, and this is also God's way of telling us that he's going to be trying to fool the world to look like he's Jesus. right? And this is why the white horse is used. And I've heard some teachers teach that this here is representative of Jesus. I've heard preachers say this. It's not. This is the Antichrist. And he's a conqueror. And notice here too, when a crown was given unto him. So at this point, when this first seal is opened, the Antichrist has some sort of authority here. He's a leader. He might be a leader of a particular nation. But whatever it is, he does have authority. A crown is given unto him. Now, it doesn't go into detail on how he receives this crown. We don't know exactly how it is that he comes to power. We can speculate. We can think it might be just through sort of traditional means where maybe the people vote him in as their president or leader of their country. Or it could be that he might usurp the power somehow. He might fool the people through his charisma and charm. There could be a coup, some sort of military coup, where he somehow gains the control of a military force within a nation and performs some sort of coup. And when you think about the world today, because you've got to be open to all these sorts of possibilities, I believe. When you look at the world today, there is so much corruption in government today. There is so much corruption at high levels of government and also amongst the corporations as well. We've got a lot of psychopaths running countries around the world today. We've got a lot of psychopaths that are CEOs of various companies. And we really do have to consider this possibility that he might, through social media, through the internet, garner a huge following before he gets into power. He could possibly just have so much charisma that he fools the people into thinking that he's going to overthrow the corruption in these governments somehow, right? And he might form some sort of a grassroots movement where people get behind him and they're like, yeah, this guy's one of the good guys. He's going to help us out. He's going to eliminate these governments or the corruption that's in these governments, performs this military coup, gains control of the country's military, and then goes to war against, these governments in the name of overthrowing their corruption and fixing the world, right? Making the world a better place for everyone, right? Who knows? I'm just speculating right now. I don't know how he's going. Now, here's the thing about the Antichrist. We know he receives his power from Satan. So this crown he receives, we know he receives it through the power of Satan, through his will and the way he works things. But I want to also point out he is a conqueror. He is militaristic. This Antichrist, this leader, he is a militaristic leader. Now, what I want to look at now this obviously lines up with Matthew 24:4, where Jesus is warning about false Christs. Right? We've already read that. And so it makes sense that when Jesus is warning about false Christs, that lines up when this first seal is opened in Revelation 6, that it is the Antichrist, the false Christ, the Antichrist, singular, versus plural that Jesus is also warning about, right? The other thing about this, when this first seal is opened, and we're going to get to this, I believe this coincides with this covenant that the Antichrist makes with many for a period of 7 years, which happens at the beginning, because this first seal, when it's opened, this is the trigger for the 7-year period starting, and we know he makes this 7-year covenant. We'll get to that, right? Let's have a look at Revelation 13. So we're going to be flipping between Matthew 24, Revelation 6, Revelation 13, and eventually Daniel 7. But let's go to Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. It reads, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority." Now this beast that's just described in Revelation, this represents a kingdom and a ruler. Now it also includes 10 kings. And it has this beast, we're going to see this in Daniel chapter 7, it has the characteristics of the beasts described in the book of Daniel, which we're going to look at right now. Because you can see that it's like unto a leopard, a bear, and a lion. So let's go to Daniel chapter 7. Now, it might be difficult, but try and hold your spot in all of these chapters, because we're going to be flipping backwards and forwards quite a bit. But I just feel it's necessary to do this so that you can follow along, so it's clear and easy to follow along here. And in Daniel chapter 7, verse 2, Daniel spake and said, "I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea, And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. Now, what we're going to see here is each beast here that the Bible describes here represents a kingdom and a king. Now, this is important because in the book of Revelation, when it mentions beast, sometimes it's referring to the kingdom itself, and other times it's referring to the Antichrist, the leader of that kingdom. Now in verse 4 it says, "The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it." Now here, this represents the Babylonian Empire. And the king is King Nebuchadnezzar in this case. Now, when we look at Nebuchadnezzar, he was the supreme ruler of Babylon, right? When you think about Nebuchadnezzar, he had full control, and whenever he made a decree, people had to abide by it. Otherwise, in some cases, they were killed, right? Depending on the decree that he made. And the best example of a decree that King Nebuchadnezzar makes is when he orders everyone to worship this golden statue, right? This decree that he makes. They have to worship this golden statue or they're going to die, right? It's worship this image or you're going to die. Now we know the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. They refuse. They're like, even if God doesn't save us, we're not going to worship your statue. We're not going to worship your image. They're thrown into the fiery furnace and Jesus protects them. We know that story. We're familiar with that story. But the point I want to make here and really hone in on here is this characteristic that King Nebuchadnezzar had just complete totalitarian control in Babylon. What he said goes. And this is exactly how it's going to be with the Antichrist. He's going to have that supreme rule in this kingdom, this beast kingdom, where what he says will go. And we can see that if we flip back to Revelation 13. In verse 15, it says, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed." There it is. That's exactly the same as what happened in that Babylonian Empire with King Nebuchadnezzar. This is the kind of power that he's going to have. When he makes a decree, you have to obey or you're going to die. Now that's one decree where people have to worship the beast or die. Here's another one. "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name." So he's got so much power that he can cause people to not be able to buy or sell goods unless they take this mark. This is the second decree that he makes. Now it's quite possible that he makes multitudes of decrees, but these are two that the Bible actually goes into detail and describes, because obviously these are going to have far-reaching, impact on everybody in the world, right? So just think about that. That's a characteristic when we look at that beast that's described in Revelation chapter 13, verse 2, where it talks about it being like a lion. That's like the Babylonian kingdom and King Nebuchadnezzar, right? That's that component. Now, continuing in Daniel 7, verse 5, "And behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised itself up on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh." Now, this particular beast, this represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and this is King Darius and King Cyrus. Now, the Bible teaches us that it's King Darius that received that Babylonian kingdom. So, as far as the king of this particular kingdom goes, I'm going to go with the biblical version, which is King Darius, not King Cyrus. I'm going to say it's King Darius, because this is who Daniel's also under when we read through those chapters in the Bible. Now, the thing about when we look at the Medo-Persian Empire and how they overthrew Babylon, it was a genius strategy. Now, I don't know if many of you are familiar with this, but what they did, historically, according to historical records, the river Euphrates was what ran through the city of Babylon. And apparently what they did was they drained the river. They diverted it so it would lower the water in that river, so that they went in through the banks of this river to get into Babylon. They were able to ford their way through the water to get in. Now, this was a great strategy for them to be able to get into Babylon, because apparently Babylon was a bit of a fortress, like almost impenetrable. And this is why they're probably so arrogant, having that feast and not really caring. And these guys take advantage of this situation, but also this genius military strategy of, penetrating into this, so-called impenetrable fortress. And what I want to say here is I believe, and when we look at the next beast, it talked about the Antichrist being a military leader, very militaristic. He going forth to conquer and conquer. He is a conqueror. And he's going to have, I think, he'll be a military genius. He will be a military genius. Because when we look at this next beast, in verse 6, after this I beheld, lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now this is the ancient Greek Empire. Now this empire was led by Alexander the Great. Now Alexander the Great is regarded as the greatest military leader in history. If you Google it and just look at it and you look at greatest military leaders of all time, Alexander the Great is right at the top, followed by Napoleon Bonaparte, and the list, it's quite a long list. But the point I want to make here is that bear and the leopard, which we're reading about now, that's composed in this final world kingdom. These characteristics, these elements. And what that tells me is that the Antichrist is going to be a genius military leader. Now, the thing about Alexander the Great, apparently, he never lost a battle. He had military campaigns that lasted more than 10 years. He never lost a single battle. And I think what we're going to see with the Antichrist, he too will never lose a battle. I don't think he'll lose a single battle. I think people are going to be so enamored with his militaristic strategies and ability and just the military abilities he's going to have and the knowledge, they're just going to be astounded. I think he's going to win some battles that people will think, how did he win that? That's impossible odds. I think this is what's going to take place. And similar to Alexander the Great, never lose a battle. Now, the point I want to make about the Greek kingdom too, and why it's described as a leopard, is the speed at which that kingdom expanded. Alexander the Great, the expansion of the borders of that Greek kingdom in the space of 10 years are enormous. So fast, it was swift, and a leopard is swift. And when we look at the Antichrist, his rise to power takes place in the space of 3.5 years. He has world domination in the space of 3.5 years. Now, if that's not quick, I don't know what is. Right? Now, World War II, Hitler made an attempt at this. Right? Now, that was from 1939 to 1945, and he failed. Here, we've got this situation where I believe the Antichrist, just like Alexander the Great, just great speed, having total control of the world in the space of 3.5 years. That's astonishing. Continue to verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth that devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, I believe this is representative of ancient Rome, and also the fact that it's got 10 horns, also sort of representative. Ancient Rome, there were many leaders. There were many rulers, many Caesars that ruled Rome. But also, this is also representative of the final kingdom, the Antichrist's kingdom also. Because when we keep reading, in verse 8 it says, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now this is the Antichrist. And we've just read from Revelation 13 that beast has 10 horns. There is no question that here in Daniel, this is definitely representative of this final kingdom. And it's kind of a dual fulfillment, if you will, where it's also ancient Rome. Now, let's go back to Revelation 13:2. So we've just looked at these different kingdoms, and I've just explained that all of these characteristics from each of these different kingdoms are in this final beast kingdom. Because let's read verse 2 again in Revelation 13. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. There it is. There's those 3 kingdoms, right, that we've just read about. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So the power is given by Satan to the beast. It has all these characteristics. So the Antichrist, he can be likened unto Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He can be likened unto King Darius, right, the Medo-Persian Empire, and Alexander the Great from the Greek Empire. All of these characteristics combined. Now, the thing about this too is, think about what's just sort of happened in Afghanistan, right? Where the Americans have been in there for 20 years. What a waste of resources, money, and human life, right? Now, I'm not giving this as an example to justify what the Antichrist is going to do, but I'll tell you this now. He's not going to get bogged down in a country for 20 years. If he's going to control the world in the space of 3.5 years and he's going to move across at this rapid speed of conquering various nations, he's not going to get bogged down. He's not going to suffer that kind of fate. Now, let's go back to Daniel chapter 7. And we're going to skip down to verse 17 here. Daniel chapter 7, verse 17. These great beasts which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. Now, I've just explained who I believe those kings are. Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, Alexander, and I believe the fourth one here it's talking about is the Antichrist himself. Now, we don't have his name. I don't know what his name. He'll have a name, I'd imagine. It'll be whatever it'll be. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell. Even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. So I'll just stop there for a second. We see here that he makes war with the saints and prevails against them. That's us. It's talking about us, the saints. Now here's the thing. He doesn't spiritually prevail against us. That's impossible. But when it talks about him overcoming the saints, it's talking about us perishing physically. Like he's going to kill us. He's going to kill a lot of saints. The Bible describes it as him overcoming them. Now we can see this if we go to Revelation chapter 13 verse 6, where this mouth speaks very great things. Right? This is the Antichrist is boastful, speaking great things. In Revelation chapter 13 verse 6 it says, and he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. There it is. It lines up perfectly. You can see how this all lines up. Now notice here it says over all kindreds, tongues and nations. That's everyone. It's not like the Antichrist just has some power just over certain parts of the world. It's the entire globe. It's the entire world. He has complete control, right? And when we think about Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to be supreme ruler over the entire world. Now, if we flip back to, I know we're doing a lot of flipping backwards and forwards, but go back to Daniel 7. We'll continue in verse 22. Daniel 7, verse 22. Until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And now listen to this. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. So those 10 horns that we see on that beast in Revelation, they represent 10 kings. They shall arise. Now listen to this. And another shall arise after them. Now this is really, really important, because what this tells me is this beast kingdom, which is at the end, which is the start of this first seal being opened, it's in place with 10 particular kings when that first seal is opened. Okay, this is really important. And he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. So out of these 10 kings, 3 of them are going to be subdued by the Antichrist. Now this is going to occur when that first seal is open and he goes forth to conquer. Okay, so he's going to subdue 3 of those kings. Now the Bible teaches that those 3 horns are plucked up by the roots. Now you've got to remember the horns represent rulers. They're kings. That means there's 3 leaders that are going to be either killed or removed from power. He's going to get rid of them when he goes forth to conquer. And verse 25, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until the time and times and the dividing of time. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to flip over to Daniel chapter 9, just go over a couple of chapters. We're only going to look at just a few verses here. Try and keep your place there, guys, if you can. I think we're finished with Daniel 7, though. So I think you're safe to leave Daniel 7. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Now, before I read this, I just want to make this point. This here, when I go through this verse, this is the final 7 years. Okay, so in the book of Daniel, there's a prophecy about the 70 weeks of years. And this is that final week, the final 7 years. Now, when I talked earlier in the sermon about there being a dual fulfillment, this has already been fulfilled in 70 AD when I read this part here. But it's also a future fulfillment, which Jesus describes in Matthew 24. So in Daniel 9:27, it says, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of the abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." Now Jesus describes this event in Matthew 24 in verse 15 when he says, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. These are the same events. Right? Now this was also fulfilled in AD 70 when the temple was destroyed and the sacrifice was ended. But it's a dual fulfillment. It's going to also happen at some point in the future. And how do we know that? Well, Christ hasn't returned yet. So all those events that Jesus describes in Matthew 24 have not occurred yet as far as the dual fulfillment of some of these prophecies is concerned. It's a future event. And when we're talking about the Antichrist, it is 100% a future event. Right? This beast that we've just been describing through Daniel chapter 7. Now this verse here that we just looked at in Daniel chapter 9 verse 27, there are some people that claim that this is about Jesus and not about the Antichrist. Well, just to prove that claim, because here's the thing, the previous verses in that chapter are all about Jesus. They're about his sacrifice, the forgiveness of sins. They're all about his death on the cross, and that's completed. That has been completed in the past. We know that event has taken place. And then people confuse that with when it switches gears here in verse 27. Now, just to prove this, if we quickly look at Daniel chapter 11, go to verse 31. Daniel 11:31, just to prove that chapter 9 verse 27 is definitely about the Antichrist. In Daniel 11:31, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." Then down in verse 36, we know this is about the Antichrist. "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done." There is no question that this is about the Antichrist. There is no question. Now let's go back to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6. In verse 3. So now we're up to the second seal. There was a lot to cover in that first seal. We should be able to move through these a lot more quickly now. Revelation chapter 6, verse 3. "And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, 'Come and see.'" Verse 4. "And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth. And they that should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword." Now here we see peace is taken from the earth. This is definitely a global war. Like when you look at, say, World War I, World War II, if these events were all to take place, say, in the next World War, then this would be World War III, if it was. Now, it could be World War IV or V. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be the next global conflict we have or maybe one after. I don't know. But here we can see that this is a global conflict, right? So you know how we get people today making false claims about the return of Jesus and they're always wrong? Well, one of the simple answers to that is because they don't understand these things that have to take place first. And the biggest one for me, with what we've looked at already just now, before I even get through the rest of these, is this war. It's a world war. Now, you could argue, well, it could have been World War I or World War II. Yeah, it could have been. During that period of time, people might have felt like, God, this is it, right? But I'm going to show you from Scripture that There is no way it could have been World War I or World War II, and what to look for. But this marries up with Matthew 24, verse 7, this second seal, where Jesus says, "For nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom," which makes sense in a global conflict, right? Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Now, let's use World War II as a bit of an example here. And I'm going to use this as a bit of an example to try and paint a picture of how these things could be unfolding, right? To just permit me to speculate a little bit here. And when we look at World War II and Adolf Hitler, and you look at the Axis and the Allies, now the Axis were, a certain allegiance, and the Allies had their allies. And World War II occurred between 1939 and 1945. Now, there were the Axis powers. Now, these powers were Germany, Italy, Japan, Hungary, Bulgaria, versus the Allies, which consisted of the US, Britain, France, USSR, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, China, Denmark, Greece, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, South Africa, Yugoslavia. That's a long list. Now, remember, we've already read that there was 10 horns, right, on this beast before the Antichrist goes forth to conquer. Now, I believe that a lot of these minor nations, to me and to God, they're just not that significant. And normally they have their allegiance to certain superpowers, like Australia, for example, with the US, right? We've got our allegiance to them. I don't, when it comes to these 10 horns, it doesn't mean necessarily that there's just 10 kingdoms on the earth. I just want to make that point too. Don't fall into the trap where you might think, well, it's just got to be just 10 rulers on the earth. No, I just think that there's just smaller nations that are just not they're just not significant to the Lord. And I'm only using World War II here as an example of just how things could play out. Now, with each of these nations here in World War II, they each had their leaders, right? So, the leaders of the Allies were Franklin Roosevelt from the United States, Winston Churchill, Great Britain, Joseph Stalin, Soviet Union, and for the main Axis powers, those leaders, say of Germany, Italy, and Japan, Adolf Hitler, Germany, Benito Mussolini, Italy, and Emperor Hirohito from Japan. Now, like I said earlier, Hitler made a failed attempt at world domination, right? He couldn't achieve it. He failed. But the Antichrist, he won't fail, like Hitler in World War II. He's going to succeed. And remember in Daniel chapter 7, just have a look at verse 24 again. It reads, "And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings." Now, I believe when the Antichrist makes his covenant, it's going to be very, very similar to, say, the situation we had in World War II, where you had the Axis and the Allies. And covenant means agreement. It's almost like, it's coming to an agreement. And I believe when he makes this covenant with many, he is going to make an agreement with 7 powerful world leaders that represent 7 of these horns on this beast. Now, for whatever reason, those 3 that he has to subdue in this war, they don't go on board. So he uses diplomacy first with this covenant. He's trying to get as many nations on board with his plans of world domination before he goes forth. Before that, when that first seal's open, he goes forth to conquer and conquers. And here I believe there's 3 powerful nations that are not on board. And he has to overcome them by militaristic means after he, uses diplomacy first. And in Revelation 13:4, have a look at this. "And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" Like, the people are asking this question because, like I said earlier, this guy's going to be some military genius that's not going to lose a single battle. And this is what causes people to ask this question, because they're like, nobody can make war with this guy. He just never loses. Now, it's also because of the alliances I believe he makes through diplomacy, through his charisma, his charm, but also just the fact that he's going to be a militaristic genius. Now, the third seal, Revelation 6, verse 5. So, it's something to consider. Now, when it comes to him making that, before we go to Revelation 6, it's something to consider. When he makes this covenant with many, we don't know if that's going to be public. It could be done behind closed doors, and then he just goes forth. It could be like a preemptive strike. Like he makes this covenant, nobody else knows about it publicly, and then he makes a secret strike on some country, and that's the first seal being opened. I don't know. That's just speculation. Or it could be very public, where you see clearly these 7 powers that they all team up, and then there's these 3 that are trying to fight against them, which are overcome by the Antichrist. Now, Revelation chapter 6, verse 5. Let's go to the 3rd seal. And when he had opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd beast say, "Come and see." And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." Now here, the thing about these 4 seals too, I want to make this point too, is I believe there's a lot of overlap with these seals. Okay, it's not necessarily that, they're divided into stages of 1 year, then 2nd year, 3rd year. I just think there's a lot of overlap here, because when you think about a global conflict, it makes sense that these things are happening as this world war is unfolding. And what we learn from this here is food is very scarce, which makes sense. Like if there's a global conflict, shipping lanes are going to be closed. Like boats will be in fear of going on the regular shipping lanes because of fear of getting blown up, or just being raided, losing their goods to some foreign nation, right? So if you think about all the shipping lanes being closed, if your country can't produce enough food for its population, well, food's going to be extremely scarce. And this here, it could also be a result of hyperinflation as well, which is something that's typical of, happening during war times as well. It happened to Germany in World War I. Their currency went through a hyperinflation. Like the German mark, I did look this up. I believe it was like less than 100 German marks for an ounce of gold. And then by the end of, I think it was like 3 years after the war, like it started during the war, but it progressively got worse and worse. And I think it was like 3 years after the war, it was like more than 1 trillion marks for an ounce of gold. Like their currency was worthless. Right, so it could also be a result of hyperinflation on top of food being scarce. And an ounce, like I just mentioned that, and after the war, all right, so I did have that written down. All right, so food's going to be scarce. Now, for us, I guess we're going to be relying on the Lord, right? We are going to have to rely on the Lord in this situation. Now, this is happening before the mark is introduced, but think about this, like if the food's already scarce before the mark's even introduced, and then when it's introduced, we can't buy or sell, we need the Lord. We're going to need the Lord. Also, it might be good just to be self-sufficient too, like have the ability to fish, grow a garden, learn how to cultivate a garden so you can grow your own food, whatever it might be. And I think, we'll have each other to help each other out as well. But it's going to be chaotic. And we're just going to see exactly how chaotic it's going to be right now. Because when we go to the 4th seal, Revelation 6 verse 7, "And when he had opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th beast say, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth." So a 4th part of the earth with death, they're going to die. That's a huge chunk of the population, right? Now, for some context here, I've already been talking about World War II, but in World War I, the death toll was approximately 40 million out of a population of about 1.8 billion at the time, which represented 2.2% of the population, give or take, roughly. At that time, that was between 1914 and 1918. World War II, the death toll was approximately 80 million out of 2.3 billion, so it was a little bit worse. It was represented about 3% of the world's population, but that was over a longer period of time. That was between 1939 and 1945. Here we have a 3.5-year period where a quarter of the Earth's population is going to be wiped out. That's 25% of the population. So as far as magnitude and scale goes, compared to World War II, that's 8 times more loss of life than World War II. Now, so the scale of this is huge, and this is why I don't think we'll make a mistake about when this starts happening. Now, we might not realise until 2 or 3 years into this thing, but I think at that point it'll become pretty apparent due to the massive loss of life that we're going to be entering into tribulation. This is the Antichrist, and be mentally prepared. Be mentally prepared, because that is a huge lot. That 1 in 4 people, that is massive. It's not something that will go unnoticed, all right? And think about this too. Back in World War I and World War II, the weapons they had were more sort of conventional. It was more conventional warfare. Think about the weapons they have today. So if we end up with a global conflict and you've got 10 superpowers involved, right? And World War II, it ended with the bombs being dropped on Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Now, to give you a bit of an idea of the power they have today compared to the bombs they dropped then, and this is frightening. Hiroshima, the bomb that got dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. The bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was 21 kilotons. Now, the devastation there was so great that it's estimated between 129,000 and 226,000 people were killed with those 2 bombs. Now, some of those were instant. Others were over a period of time because of the radiation, poisoning. Now, modern weapons of warfare, what we have today, it's frightening. And Russia, right, as an example, they have successfully tested a 50 megaton nuclear bomb. 50 megatons. That's 50,000 kilotons. Now, remember I told you the one in Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. This is 50,000 kilotons. 3,333 times more powerful than that bomb. So it's no wonder that the loss of life described here in Revelation is just so huge. And when you think about population centres in the world, they tend to be very concentrated in major cities. Like they're all concentrated in cities. And so this is how I believe that this loss of life can be so huge. And it's not just the direct result of the bombs and the weapons of warfare. It's also indirect when we see the pestilences, the scarcity of food, starvation. All those factors combined is going to result in, like if this was to happen in the near future, we've got 8 billion people on the earth. That's 2 billion people that are going to perish during this 3.5-year period of time. That's a massive loss of life. But when you look at these weapons that are available to them today, it's no wonder that the loss of life is going to be so huge. Today, there are an estimated 14,900 nuclear weapons in the world. So the idea, like my purpose behind this sermon was to try and just just dig in and just have a look at some real detail on this first 3.5 years to give us an idea of what to look out for. All right. Now, I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen in the next World War. Maybe the next World War might not be on this bigger scale. I find that hard to believe when you look at the weapons they've got. I can't fathom how you could have a world war and have a small loss of life. I can't see that happening. But just ponder on this, think about this, and just let this sink in, because I think this is something that's really important, and it'll certainly help you to avoid, when people bring up certain things like, oh, this is the mark of the beast, and oh, look at this, and there is going to be a mark of the beast. But scripturally, there's a lot of water that has to go under the bridge before that takes place, right? Before the Antichrist is even in power. Or this global conflict has to take place first. Things are going to be so chaotic. And something else to think about too, and I thought about this, and once again, it's just speculation. Things are going to be so chaotic during this period of time that we've got today the luxury of the internet, communication. It's easy to find out what's happening around the world. During this period of time, we might not have that. Communications could be down. And when Jesus says wars and rumours of wars, I believe he says that for a reason. Like, it's not just the wars, it's also the rumours, because people won't have the same communication and levels of information being transferred during this chaotic period of time. The internet could be down. You might not be able to find out what's happening on the other side of the world. You're relying on what others are telling you, and it's like, rumours abound, right, about what's going on. So let's pray.